A naval surge that unfolded not over weeks or months, but in 72 hours. 72 hours that redrew the security map of East Asia, 72 hours that forced London to issue its most urgent Pacific declaration since the end of the Cold War, 72 hours that pushed Japan to activate defense protocols not seen in the post-war era. What Beijing did this week crossed a line that Western capitals had hoped would hold, and when that line broke, Tokyo did not hesitate. They responded with precision, resolve, and a clarity of purpose that caught even their own allies off guard. London's declaration tonight, described by Whitehall sources as grave, was not diplomatic posturing. It was a warning that the rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific is now facing its most serious challenge in decades. And Japan, for the first time since 1945, has shown that it is prepared to defend that order with more than words. For 18 months now, there had been signals, not official communiques, not formal diplomatic notes, just signals, that Beijing was preparing something unprecedented. China has been assertive, yes, but they have been predictable in their assertiveness. Their moves have followed a certain rhythm, a cadence, almost a choreography. Naval exercises would be announced, diplomatic protests would follow, then a cooling period, then another provocation. Analysts in London, Washington, and Tokyo had grown accustomed to this cycle, but what set off alarm bells in Whitehall and the Japanese Ministry of Defense this month was that the rhythm went silent. Intelligence officers who monitor Chinese naval activity know the indicators: the positioning of supply vessels, the unusual concentration of submarine traffic in the Philippine Sea, the movement of hospital ships to forward staging areas, the sudden recall of diplomatic staff from regional postings. All of that went quiet. And whenever Beijing goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. British signals intelligence, working in coordination with Japan's Defense Intelligence Headquarters, had tracked these patterns for weeks. What they saw was not preparation for a routine exercise. What they saw was preparation for something operational, something designed not merely to signal intent, but to create facts on the water. Early Tuesday morning, Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force radar stations detected what they described as an unprecedented concentration of People's Liberation Army Navy surface combatants, including Type 0555 destroyers and the Shandong carrier strike group that had not been deployed to these waters in over 14 months. These are the kinds of assets that Beijing only deploys when they are signaling something very specific: a claim of sovereignty, a demonstration of dominance, or a prelude to coercive action. Tokyo didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Beijing was changing its posture. And when a nuclear-armed power shifts posture without explanation, even by a single nautical mile, every intelligence service in the region pays attention. The concentration was not in the South China Sea, where such deployments have become routine. It was in the East China Sea, near the Senkaku Islands, within Japan's air defense identification zone. This was not ambiguity, this was provocation. And London, watching through the eyes of its Indo-Pacific intelligence partnerships, recognized immediately what was happening. The declaration issued by London tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Foreign Office officials, after emergency meetings at Whitehall, described Beijing's move as destabilizing, provocative, and perhaps most importantly, inconsistent with all prior diplomatic assurances Beijing had given regarding the East China Sea. British Foreign Secretary James Cleverly, in a hastily arranged press conference, said the government was gravely concerned by the scale and positioning of Chinese naval assets near Japanese territorial waters. But declarations only work if the target hesitates. Beijing did not. In fact, in the 12 hours following Britain's warning, Chinese naval vessels moved closer to the disputed islands, not further away, which is why Japan's response today was among the most significant we've seen in the post-war period. Here's what we know. Within 4 hours of detecting the Chinese naval surge, Japan's Prime Minister Fumio Kishida convened an emergency meeting of the National Security Council. These weren't routine consultations. These were Article 9 discussions, the kind of constitutional deliberations that Japan only undertakes when they are preparing to invoke their right to collective self-defense. Tonight, Japanese defense officials confirmed that Japan launched coordinated air and sea patrols along the entire length of the Nansei Island chain, including Yonaguni Island, Japan's westernmost inhabited territory. that had recently been reinforced with anti-ship missile batteries for what analysts believe was exactly this kind of scenario. Japan scrambled F-35 stealth fighters before Beijing could establish air superiority over the disputed zone. They deployed Soryu-class submarines to shadow the Chinese carrier group. They activated shore-based Type 12 anti-ship missiles that were likely being targeted at the Shandong's escort vessels. They coordinated with United States 7th Fleet assets operating in the Philippine Sea. In other words, Japan targeted the operational heart of Beijing's naval surge, the command and control nodes that would have made a sustained presence viable. This is what made London's warning so urgent. Beijing's surge wasn't just symbolic, it was actionable. It represented the kind of move that could create a permanent Chinese naval presence in waters Japan considers sovereign if left unchecked. And Tokyo, understanding that fully, responded with force, not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't fire on Chinese vessels. They didn't escalate to kinetic action. They created a defensive perimeter so comprehensive that any Chinese advance would require Beijing to initiate hostilities. They shifted the burden of escalation back onto the provocateur. And here's where the story becomes even more alarming. British and American intelligence analysts now believe that Beijing's latest move was designed to test the cohesion of the Western alliance after months of distraction in Ukraine and the Middle East. Beijing wanted to see whether Japan would defer, whether London would equivocate, whether Washington would delay, but instead the opposite happened. Japan didn't defer. They activated protocols that had been rehearsed but never implemented. London didn't equivocate. They issued a declaration so direct, so unambiguous that even Beijing's foreign ministry noticed. You don't get Beijing's attention easily, but today the combined response of Japan and Britain did. Defense analysts speaking with Reuters under anonymity described Beijing's shift as strategic probing, a way to identify cracks in the alliance structure before committing to more aggressive action. But Japan proved today that they remain both capable and willing. Their deployments were not only rapid, they were positioned so precisely that Chinese reconnaissance aircraft were forced to alter their flight paths within hours. That detail matters because it shows that Japan's integrated air and missile defense architecture is no longer theoretical. It shows that Japan is not a passive observer of its own security. They are an active guarantor. As reports continued coming in throughout the evening, we learned more about the scale of Japan's response. Japanese Aegis destroyers carried out coordinated tracking operations with U.S. Navy vessels, forcing Chinese submarines to reposition to avoid detection. Japanese Air Self-Defense Force P-1 maritime patrol aircraft targeted Chinese resupply vessels that had been identified crossing into the East China Sea in the last 48 hours. Japanese ground self-defense force units operating on Ishigaki Island reportedly activated radar systems used by Japan to coordinate with American missile defense assets. This wasn't just a patrol. This wasn't just a demonstration. This was integrated deterrence. This was denial of strategic initiative. And denial of strategic initiative is the one thing Beijing has struggled to maintain since the announcement of AUKUS and the expansion of the Quad. For every advance Beijing has made, the alliance structure has countered with something that complicates their calculus. Remember, Beijing thought Japan would remain constitutionally paralyzed. They thought London would prioritize trade relationships over security commitments. They thought Washington would be too distracted by domestic politics to coordinate an effective response. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Japan is activating defense capabilities that were once considered politically impossible. London is issuing declarations that align it explicitly with Indo-Pacific security frameworks. Washington is coordinating in real time with both allies through channels that have been years in the making. The irony is unmistakable. Beijing's surge, intended to expose alliance weakness, has instead demonstrated alliance strength. And that miscalculation may be remembered as one of the defining errors of this decade. What makes this moment so significant and so dangerous is that Beijing's latest move happened at a time when President Xi Jinping is under domestic pressure. Nationalists want demonstration of strength. The military establishment wants validation of their modernization investments. Economic reformers want stability that would allow for recovery. Regional officials want clarity on central government priorities. Xi is balancing these demands while managing an economy that has shown persistent signs of strain. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. Tonight's events must be understood in that context. This was not a calculated master stroke. This was a roll of the dice by a government that needed to change the narrative. London's declaration, now distributed to every major world capital through diplomatic channels, was designed to signal that Britain is not willing to see Japanese sovereignty eroded through coercion. British officials said plainly that Beijing's naval surge was inconsistent with the peaceful resolution of disputes and the principles of the UN Charter. That is Foreign Office language for, we see what you're doing and we're on record opposing it. You don't usually hear that tone from London unless something serious is at stake. And tonight, something serious is at stake. The precedent that naval coercion can alter territorial claims in the Indo-Pacific. If that precedent is allowed to stand, Taiwan will be next. The Philippines will follow. Vietnam will have no recourse. London understands this, and that understanding is what drove tonight's grave declaration. Meanwhile, Japan's Prime Minister Kishida addressed his cabinet in a brief, measured speech tonight. He said, Japan will not be intimidated by actions designed to undermine regional stability. He said, our commitment to the defense of our territory is unwavering. And he said, we stand with our allies in ensuring that the rules-based order remains the foundation of peace in Asia. These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a nation that understands just how high the stakes have become. Japan's post-war identity has been defined by restraint. Tonight, Kishida signaled that restraint does not mean passivity. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Beijing's latest move wasn't isolated. Along with the naval surge in the East China Sea, Russian Pacific Fleet vessels were observed conducting exercises in waters north of Hokkaido. North Korean missile units increased readiness levels along the eastern seaboard. Chinese cyber operations increased activity targeting Japanese critical infrastructure. All of this happened within the same 72-hour window. When Beijing moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. And that something larger appears to be a coordinated pressure campaign designed to overwhelm Japan's response capacity. Intelligence analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Beijing is preparing a sustained presence operation, deploying assets for long enough to establish a new status quo. Another is that Beijing is attempting to create a crisis that would draw American attention away from other theaters. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Beijing is attempting to establish the conditions for a Taiwan scenario by first neutralizing Japan's response options. But today, Japan took that card off the table. They didn't wait for Allied consensus. They didn't defer to diplomatic timelines. They didn't allow Beijing to establish facts before responding. They acted, and in acting, they demonstrated that the first mover advantage Beijing has relied upon can be countered with speed, coordination, and resolve. What we're watching now is a test of alliance architecture. Beijing wants to see whether Japan can sustain this response. Tokyo wants to show that their defense modernization has been worth the investment. London wants to prevent any outcome that would suggest Western disunity. And Washington wants to prevent any outcome that would embolden further Chinese coercion. All four objectives are now in play. Tonight, we've heard from 7th Fleet commanders who are now monitoring the situation in real time. They say American carrier assets in the region have increased readiness levels. They say intelligence sharing with Japan has been expanded under emergency protocols. And they say Beijing's decision to surge naval forces toward Japanese waters is likely part of a broader coercion strategy intended to fracture Allied coordination. But Japan is not fracturing. In fact, Japan is demonstrating capabilities that even some allies had underestimated. Their response today, rapid, proportionate, and coordinated, sent a message to Beijing that coercion will be met with resistance, and it sent a message to London and Washington that Japan is a pillar of Indo-Pacific security, not merely a beneficiary. As the week goes on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Beijing hoped to achieve. But what we do know is that London's declaration was timely. It aligned Western capitals behind a shared position. It validated Japan's response as consistent with international norms, and it signaled to Beijing that the cost of escalation has just increased. What happens next will depend on what Beijing does in the next 48 hours. If they de-escalate, this moment will be remembered as a failed probe. If they double down, Japan and its allies have already shown they are prepared. They have shown they are ready to respond. And tonight, for the first time in years, Beijing appears to be recalculating. Zhongnanhai is quiet, too quiet. And when Beijing is quiet, it means they are reassessing. It means they are choosing their next move carefully. because tonight Beijing learned something they should have known from the start. Japan is no longer the pacifist observer of Asia's security dynamics. The Western alliance is no longer divided by geographic distance, and the rules-based order, for all its imperfections, still has defenders. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. Japan is awake. London is engaged, and the Indo-Pacific balance has shifted, and we will be here watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.